Clint Eastwood loved his morning coffee and fresh cookies. It was one of the few little things that remained unchanged in his life. He was a man of old school, reserved, tempered by years and experience. His gait was confident, and his gaze was piercing. But today, something in the air felt off. When Clint opened the door to the small bakery in the city center, a quiet bell rang inside. The scent of freshly baked bread and cinnamon filled the space, creating a sense of homely comfort. But as soon as he stepped across the threshold, all conversations inside seemed to stop. Behind the counter stood a young girl with red hair, possibly no older than 20. She looked at Clint tensely, then her gaze dropped to his neck. A silver cross hung on his chest. Somewhere in the corner, a woman in an expensive suit whispered something to her companion. A young man in the establishment staff uniform looked up, sized Clint up with a glance, sighed, and walked over. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private establishment. We reserve the right to refuse service." Clint calmly shifted his gaze to the young man. "Are you refusing to serve me pastries?" "Aye." "It's the policy of the establishment, sir." The young man was clearly nervous but didn't back down. Eastwood squinted. He didn't shout, didn't argue, just stood there, staring straight ahead. "The policy of the establishment? Because of my cross?" Someone in the corner awkwardly looked away, while others watched the situation with keen interest. "We just don't want any conflicts." Finally, the red-haired girl behind the counter spoke up. "Some customers might feel uncomfortable." Clint ran his hand over his chin, smoothing his stubble. "Are you saying that my presence here is a problem?" The young man pressed his lips together, and the girl sighed. Someone in the corner smiled, and someone else snorted derisively. The tension in the air grew. Clint Eastwood didn't move. His silence weighed more than any words. "This story is far from over." "Sir, we don't want any trouble," the young man behind the counter repeated nervously, clutching a towel in his hands. "Just please, leave." Clint Eastwood didn't budge. He slowly surveyed the room as if assessing everyone present. At one of the tables, a man in an expensive suit drank his coffee with open disdain. Next to him, a woman deliberately looked away. A young guy in a hoodie with headphones shook his head, staring at his phone. "I just wanted to buy a pastry," Clint said in a steady, almost calm voice. "Is that forbidden now?" "It's the establishment's policy." The young man began again, but his voice cracked. "What kind of policy is this?" came a gruff male voice from the corner. All eyes turned to the elderly man sitting by the window. His face was wrinkled, and his hands were calloused from years of hard work. He slowly set down his cup. "I've been coming here for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, looking at the red-haired girl behind the counter. "John," the girl grew nervous, We don't want provocations." "Provocations?" Clint finally spoke, his voice low and confident. "This is not a provocation, miss. It's a normal morning, and I just wanted a bun." Suddenly, the kitchen door creaked open, and a burly man in a white apron stepped out. His face was red, and his movements were sharp. "What's going on here?" he growled. "Jesse, you're stalling again?" "He won't leave," the girl replied nervously. "And he shouldn't." John, the elderly man at the table, snapped. The cook glanced at him, then at Clint. "Listen, sir," he said, now addressing Eastwood. "We have our own rules here. We don't want any misunderstandings." Clint slowly took a step forward, his boots making a dull thud on the wooden floor. "Do you think the problem is with me?" "People just want peace," the cook cut in. "People? Or you?" Silence fell. "So, if someone doesn't like my cross, I can't be here?" Clint asked. The cook couldn't find a reply. "Listen, old man," the young guy in the hoodie suddenly intervened, finally looking up from his phone. "Nobody wants a scene. Just leave, okay?" "Not old man, Clint," Eastwood replied calmly. The young man shrugged. "Doesn't matter. The world has changed.
Really?
How so? Clint raised an eyebrow. We're moving forward, the woman in the suit chimed in. Jesus on the wall or a cross around the neck isn't to everyone's liking anymore. We need to be modern. And being modern means pushing people away because of their faith? It's not about faith. The girl behind the counter shouted. It's about customer comfort. Clint looked her straight in the eye. It's about fear. She pressed her lips together. I'll take 1 cinnamon bun. And a black coffee. No milk. The red-haired girl trembled. If you're going to kick me out, do it loudly. I want to hear how America has changed. The girl glanced at the cook. He remained silent. I asked you, Clint turned to the young man behind the counter. You just want to make a scene, he muttered. I want a bun. The tension reached its peak. The red-haired girl froze, as if trapped. Her fingers gripped the edge of her apron, and her eyes darted between Clint, the cook, and the young man behind the counter. The tension in the air became almost palpable. Jesse, don't you dare. The cook growled. Give him the bun, muttered John, the old man at the table. Nobody is giving anything. The cook barked, slamming his palm onto the counter. Jesse flinched. Don't you see what he's doing? The cook continued. He wants to make us look like fanatics. Clint didn't move. I want a bun. The woman in the suit rolled her eyes. God, this is just theater. Sir, they don't want to serve you here. Are you seriously going to stand here like a stubborn old man? Clint slowly turned to her. Didn't you just say that the world has changed? That we need to move forward? She pressed her lips together. And you're against change? I'm for not kicking someone out because of their faith, Clint answered calmly. The cook lost his patience. You know what, old man? He stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. If you don't leave on your own, I'll help you. Really? Clint didn't even change his expression. The cook was tall, burly, weighing no less than 200 pounds. His massive hands spoke of years of working with heavy dough. But as he got closer to Clint, he noticed something in his eyes that made him slow his pace. Clint stood upright, not tensing his shoulders or clenching his fists. His gaze was calm, but there was something in it that made even experienced people tread carefully. I told you, the cook hissed, get out of here. Clint tilted his head. And what if I refuse? The cook gritted his teeth. You want a fight, huh? He slammed his chest with his fist. You think I won't hit an old man? I think you'll think carefully before you do that, Clint said quietly. He didn't even move, but the atmosphere in the bakery changed. A few people held their breath. The young guy in the hoodie turned off his music and leaned forward a little. It's just a bun, said John from the corner. The cook shot him a glance, then looked back at Clint. We don't want people like you here. And who exactly do you mean by people like me? The cook clenched his fists. Did you hear that? Clint turned his head toward the other patrons. He can't even explain who he's afraid of. I'm not afraid of you. The cook shouted. Clint slowly nodded. Then what's the problem? Silence. Jessie pressed her lips together, her hands trembling. Jessie, Clint said quietly. Just do your job. She looked at the cook. Jessie, he shouted. She flinched. But then slowly turned to the pastry shelves. She picked up a cinnamon bun with tongs and placed it in a bag. And put it in front of Clint. The bakery was deathly silent. The cook turned red. You're fired. Jessie clenched her fists but said nothing. Really? Clint said quietly, looking the cook straight in the eyes. For what? For disobedience. For selling a bun to a customer? The cook gasped with fury. Take your money and leave, he shouted. Clint slowly placed a bill on the counter. No change needed. He took the bag, took a step back. And without taking his eyes off the cook, he stopped. "People often fear not what is bad, but what they don't understand," he said. But fear never made the world better. He turned around and walked out. Jesse stood still. The bakery seemed frozen in tense silence. But somewhere in the corner, a sound was heard, soft, almost imperceptible. John started clapping. Slowly. Then someone else. And another. The cook felt his skin burn with shame. He wanted to say something, to justify himself, but the words got stuck in his throat. And Clint was already walking down the street, tossing the bag with the bun in his hand. And strangely, the bun smelled even better than usual. Clint stepped out onto the street, and the cold wind immediately hit his face, but he paid no attention to it. The bun in the bag felt heavy, as though the weight of the world had settled on him. He walked, and for several more minutes, the echo of the conflict lingered behind him, like a menacing shadow that refused to leave the bakery. But suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. They were quick, aggressive, and for some reason, he immediately sensed that this wasn't just a passerby. "Where are you going, old man?" A harsh male voice shouted. Clint turned around, and standing before him was the same cook from the bakery, but now he was with another guy, thin, with black eyes. Wearing a black jacket that didn't seem to fit well on his shoulders. He looked like a bodyguard. "Didn't you get it?" The cook grabbed him by the sleeve, yanking it hard, as if trying to drag Clint back into the bakery. Clint stopped, his gaze becoming cold and determined. "Let go." His voice was calm, but with each word, there was an unshakable firmness. The cook didn't listen. He pulled the sleeve harder and leaned in closer. "You think it's that simple? You came here, mocked me, and now you want to take the bun and leave peacefully? You understand that I have my reputation?" Clint didn't respond. He carefully placed the bag on the ground and looked at him. "What are you doing?" The cook furrowed his brows, feeling that the situation was starting to change. "You want me to leave?" Clint asked calmly. "I'll leave. But if you don't let go of me, we'll be standing here a long time." The black guy on his side took a few steps forward, tilting his head. "You think we don't have enough trouble with the bakery?" He reached out, trying to push Clint. "Go, before it's too late." But Clint didn't move. His face remained unchanged, his gaze steady. "If you want trouble, I'll give it to you," he said quietly, but this time his voice wasn't just calm, it was as sharp as a blade. "But I don't hit if I don't have to." The cook and the guy fell silent. There was something palpable in their eyes, confusion and uncertainty. For the first time, they found themselves in a situation where the other person wasn't afraid of them. And then, as often happens in tense moments, one of them couldn't hold back. The black guy moved first, swinging his arm to shove Clint. But Clint grabbed his wrist, squeezing with such force that the guy immediately recoiled. "I warned you," Clint said coldly, without taking a single step back. The silence seemed like it could break windows. The man in front of him felt his anger melt away, his hands suddenly losing all strength. And instead of continuing the rough game, he released Clint. "Take your bun and go," the cook muttered, stepping back. Clint picked up the bag and took it in his hand. He took a step forward and looked at them once more. "That was your last chance," he said, turning around and walking down the street. "Don't go looking for trouble from now on." His voice was so calm and convincing that even his footsteps sounded like a bell that couldn't be stopped. And though the shadow of the unresolved conflict still lingered behind him, Clint no longer looked back. He knew that moment would stay in their heads much longer than they imagined. As Clint walked away from the bakery, the tension still simmering in the cool air, he could feel the weight of the encounter behind him. The sound of his footsteps echoed down the empty street, steady and determined. The bag in his hand felt almost symbolic, something small, but heavy with meaning. He had come here for a simple pastry, but what had unfolded was far from simple. As he turned the corner, the street opened up into a small park. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. It was a quiet place, far removed from the chaos of the bakery. Clint slowed his pace, breathing in the cool air, and for the first time that day, his mind began to settle. The whole encounter had been a test, and not just for them, but for him. It had been a test of character, of standing firm in the face of intimidation, of choosing the path of understanding over aggression. In a world where conflict seemed to be the default, where every exchange felt like it could escalate into something bigger, Clint had chosen a different route. And in doing so, he'd learned something about himself. He wasn't just standing up for his right to buy a simple pastry. No, it was bigger than that. It was about standing up against the cruelty and injustice that often lurked in the smallest places. It was about making a choice, not to retaliate, but to confront the situation with dignity, and in turn, demand that same dignity from others. As Clint reached a bench in the park, he sat down and glanced at the bag in his hand. The smell of fresh baked goods drifted out, a small, comforting scent amidst the tension of the day. He took a deep breath, unwrapped the pastry, and took a bite. It was sweet, simple, perfect. And in that moment, Clint realized that sometimes change doesn't come from grand gestures or loud confrontations. Sometimes it comes from quiet moments, from refusing to be swept up in the chaos and instead, choosing to stand tall in the face of it. He finished the pastry, wiped his hands on a napkin, and stood up. The park was peaceful now, and Clint felt the first real sense of peace he'd had all day. As he walked away from the bench, he knew that the bakery would never be the same. He didn't need to be there to see the change, he had already made it happen. By refusing to bow to intimidation, by choosing the high road, he had done something powerful. He had planted a seed. The world may not change overnight, but Clint had taken the first step. And that, in itself, was enough to keep him moving forward. The following morning, the sun rose over the city, casting a warm golden light on the familiar streets. Clint stood in front of his apartment, the events of the previous day still fresh in his mind, but with a sense of resolve that had settled deep within him. The bakery had become more than just a place of pastries, it had become a symbol of something larger, something that transcended the trivial conflicts of the day before. Clint had not expected change to come so quickly, but when he received a call from the bakery owner, he knew something had shifted. The voice on the other end of the line was apologetic, sincere. "Mr. Eastwood," the bakery owner began, "I wanted to personally thank you for what happened yesterday. I've had a long talk with my staff, and we're making changes. We're instituting new policies to make sure nothing like that ever happens again. No one should be treated that way, not even you. I'm sorry for what you experienced." Clint smiled faintly, the familiar weight of the situation now lighter on his shoulders. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about people being treated with respect. We all deserve that, especially when we're just trying to buy a simple loaf of bread." There was a long pause on the other end. Then the owner spoke again, his voice softer. "You're right. Thank you for reminding me of that." Clint hung up, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment, though it wasn't something he'd intended. What had started as a confrontation over something small had somehow led to a shift, a small but significant shift, within the bakery's walls. And while it may not change the world, it had certainly changed that small corner of it. He stepped outside, his gaze taking in the familiar sights of the city, the bustling streets, the traffic, the hum of life. Everything seemed the same, yet different. The city was still the same chaotic place, full of its own conflicts and noise, but Clint had found a way to bring a bit of quiet dignity to it. A bit of peace amidst the turmoil. As he walked through the streets, the faces of the people he passed seemed a little less distant. The world felt a little less heavy. He didn't need to win every battle, or even every war. He just needed to know that, in some small way, he had made a difference. And so, Clint Eastwood walked on, knowing that even the smallest action could ripple out and touch the lives of others in ways he couldn't always see.